Hello, my name is Otoma Edje. Welcome to Image Bearers. This is the second season, the 27th episode. I'm so excited today to have with us Richard Rothstein, who is actually a senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And Richard Rothstein wrote this incredible book right here called The Color of Law. It was published in 2017. And I'm just going to read a little bit about it before we jump in. So as I mentioned, he's the author of the book. It covers a forgotten history of how the federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods in patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. So when I read this book, I was just blown away by a lot of the historical things that you have placed in the book, and we'll cover that in our time today. And I recommend to anyone who wants to better understand the history of our housing, this is an incredible book to read. Also with us today, we have Dr. Douglas Jacoby. So honored to have you on the program today also. Dr. Jacoby is an international Bible teacher in our family of churches, the International Church of Christ. And he has been serving this capacity for about 3 decades. He has written over 30 books, pops them out just like that, like hotcakes. So again, just very excited to have you on the program also.
Thank you, Otoma.
Go ahead and jump in. So why don't you go ahead and start us out, Mr. Jacoby, with the first question.
Happy to do that. I want to just make sure you can see I've got my copy as well, which I read last week. I wandered into a bookstore. It looked interesting. And I don't know, it kind of caught fire. Incredible. So thank you for the invitation, but also thank you for the book, Richard. I certainly needed to read that. I think one thing that'll be helpful for many listeners is just simply to clarify the difference between de facto and de jure segregation. So maybe you could speak to that first.
Sure. We have a national myth, a rationalization that we have adopted to avoid confronting the fact that we're an apartheid society. I've lived in many metropolitan areas. Everyone that I've lived in was racially segregated. Clearly defined areas that were white, clearly defined areas that were black. In the 20th century, we abolished segregation and lunch counters and buses, public accommodations, and interstate transportation and employment, and a variety of other institutions, and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is residential segregation that underlies all the other inequalities in the society. And as I say, we've adopted a rationalization for that. And the rationalization for not addressing it goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of buses or lunch counters or schools or colleges, that was all created by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation, a civil rights violation. And we understand that if there's a Fifth Amendment violation, a civil rights violation, we have an obligation as American citizens to remedy it. State and local governments were doing it. It's a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, also a civil rights violation that we have an obligation to remedy. But we tell ourselves that racial segregation of neighborhoods, that's an entirely different thing. That didn't happen because of government law or regulation or public policy. It just sort of happened naturally. It happened by accident. Bigoted homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans, or maybe businesses in the private economy, banks or real estate agents, discriminated in how they carry out their private economic activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race, and so we associate with each other in neighborhoods that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's income differences. All of these individual, bigoted, but nonetheless non-governmental decisions is what's created residential segregation. We tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. Many of us think it's too bad we live in a society that's so segregated, but because it wasn't created by government, there's nothing we have an obligation to do anything about. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said that if government didn't create it, they give a name for this. They say we have de facto segregation, segregation that just happened by accident. The Supreme Court says if the government didn't create it, the government is powerless to do anything to undo it. So it's critically important that we understand this history, because once we understand that residential segregation was created by government as a result of public policy, law, regulation, explicit, racially explicit policy, not the unintended consequences of race-neutral policies, but racial explicit policy designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. Once we understand this is a government creation as much as school segregation or lunch counter segregation was, then it follows necessarily that it's a civil rights violation. The racial boundaries of every metropolitan area in this country are a civil rights violation, unconstitutional, and as American citizens, we have an obligation to remedy it.
Right, so the de jure, that's by law, de facto is this idea that segregation just happened. That's the myth you're overturning. And it's so well documented. The color of law is filled with examples of how government programs, as you said, exclude or have hurt African Americans unfairly. And maybe you could share one of those examples with us. The book is full of them. Levittown comes to mind, but
okay.
Flesh it out a little bit for us.
I'll start with that one. In the post-World War II period, the federal government began an explicit, racially explicit policy to move the white working class, lower middle class population out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. We were not a suburban country before that time, before the post-World War II period. Working families weren't living in the suburbs. They didn't have cars to drive to work. The jobs were all in downtown areas near factories, near deep water ports or railroad terminals. So you had many broadly integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas where both black and white workers lived. Well, the federal government began a policy, explicit, racially explicit, to move white families out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. And you mentioned Levittown, that's probably the best known one. East of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. Levitt could never have assembled, William Levitt, the builder of that development, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land, build those homes. He didn't have any buyers as yet, hadn't marketed any. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do that. The banks didn't think anybody would want to buy these homes. Like I say, we were in a suburban country at that time. This was a new idea. The only way that Levitt, and there were hundreds and hundreds of developers like him in every metropolitan area of this country, the only way they could get the capital to buy the land, build the houses, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration or the Veterans Administration, submitting their plans for the development, the architectural designs of the homes, the building materials they were going to use, and an explicit commitment required by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, never to sell a home to an African American. These two federal agencies even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats in the federal government. This was an explicit written policy, federal policy. Federal Housing Administration issued something called the Underwriting Manual, distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to get federal bank guarantees for their subdivisions. The Underwriting Manual said not only could you not get a federal bank guarantee for a subdivision that was going to sell to African Americans, you couldn't even get a bank guarantee for an all-white development if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would, quote, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. Let me just say, this is, the notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. The suburbanization of this country was an explicit, racially explicit policy that was denied to African Americans and extended to whites.
It's amazing. I travel a lot in the world. One of the countries I go to most frequently is South Africa. So of course, in the 70s and the 80s, I'm looking down on the South Africans for apartheid, oblivious of what our own laws say. So I'm wondering, are the law schools picking up your book or universities starting to recommend this?
Well, I assume so. You know, the book has had very great unexpected success. So I'm sure that some of the readers are students in the law schools, but the book is not addressed to lawyers or to college students. It's addressed to citizens. Right. Because as I said, it describes a century of civil rights violations to create residential segregation. And as citizens, we have an obligation to remedy them.
So next question I have is, can you please share how racial zoning, specifically on the state level and beyond, and also state-sanctioned violence were used to harm African-American and minority communities?
Well, sure. Let me take them separately. I'll give you this example. In the mid-1950s, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in a all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. The white homeowner had an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and child, a good job, wanted to buy a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in this all-white suburb of Shively, resold it to his African-American friend. When the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And, you know, it's a civil rights violation, a 14th Amendment violation. The police are agents of the state. And I looked into this a bit further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of examples of police-protected, sometimes even police-organized, police-led mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased and rented in a white neighborhood. Every one of these was a civil rights violation, a 14th Amendment violation if the police were doing nothing to stop this violence. And the reason as I say, there were hundreds and hundreds of these all over the country, and not just in border states like Kentucky, but in New York and Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles and San Francisco. Hundreds of these examples of police-protected mob violence. The reason I like the Louisville one so much as an example is because in 2007, the Supreme Court examined a school desegregation plan of the Louisville, Kentucky School District. And the schools in Louisville, Kentucky, as everywhere, are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated. And the Supreme Court prohibited the school district of Louisville, Kentucky from implementing the school desegregation plan on the grounds that the schools were segregated because the neighborhoods were segregated de facto without any government involvement. And therefore the government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. So you compare that Supreme Court decision to this just one incident of mob violence, police-protected mob violence, and you can see how absurd our current de facto theory is that the Supreme Court has adopted. So far as other local laws that you asked about, let me say that once we've created this residential segregation on an unconstitutional basis, you don't need racially explicit laws to maintain or reinforce it. Because if you impose a race-neutral policy on a segregated race-specific construct, you can reinforce the segregation. So perhaps the biggest policy today that reinforces and expands racial segregation are zoning rules. which are race neutral, but by prohibiting the construction in many of the subdivisions that were very inexpensive when they were built, like Levittown, like Shively, prohibiting in those subdivisions the construction of anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes, what you do is you perpetuate the segregation that was unconstitutionally created. Those zoning rules, in my judgment, and nobody has challenged me on this, those zoning rules are unconstitutional because they're perpetuating an unconstitutionally created situation.
So I think in the first question that Dr. Jacoby had asked, one of the things that seems clear to me as I read your book is the de jure segregation that's there. And so I want to see if you can address that a little bit, if you can tease it out a little bit more, specifically from 1866 and 1968. I think you noted in your book in the very beginning that for 102 years, it was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were not adhered to, essentially. Can you address that a little bit?
Well, when you refer to the 102 years, I think what you're referring to is a post-Civil War law that was passed in 1866 that made the 13th Amendment, let me begin, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Mm-hmm. But it also had a section that authorized Congress to eliminate the badges and incidents of slavery, the characteristics of slavery, any form of second-class citizenship. One of the forms of second-class citizenship is the restriction on the ownership, sale, and rental of property. Mm-hmm. Under that 13th Amendment authority, Congress in 1866 adopted a law that prohibited racial discrimination in housing of any kind. The Supreme Court refused to enforce that law until 1968, 102 years later, during which period, private interests and government implemented a very rigorous plan of residential segregation. The federal government's policy to actually create segregation didn't begin until 1933, at the New Deal in the Roosevelt administration during the Depression, because prior to that time, the federal government wasn't involved in housing policy at all. So it's not that it wasn't segregationist, but it wasn't creating any houses to segregate. But the New Deal brought the federal government into the housing market for the first time. And every action that the federal government did was taken on a segregated basis. I mentioned earlier that in the mid-20th century, early 20th century, we had many downtown integrated neighborhoods simply because workers in downtown factory districts had to live close enough to be able to walk to work or take short streetcar rides. So black and white workers were living in broadly integrated neighborhoods. I'm not saying every other house was a different race, but broadly integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, segregated many of those communities, creating segregation where otherwise previously hadn't existed. So I hope maybe you're familiar with the great African-American poet and novelist Langston Hughes. Mm-hmm. He wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in a downtown integrated Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. Not surprising, he went to an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood in downtown Cleveland. That's not what we think of downtown Cleveland as being today. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood and demolished housing and built two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation that exists to this day. And with other projects also segregated throughout the city, reinforce that segregation. This happened everywhere. In my book, I like to talk where I can about self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than every place else. Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example, maybe you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half black and half white. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood and built two separate projects, one designated for whites, one designated for blacks, creating segregation there where it hadn't previously existed. So the history of this is long. The refusal, as you say, of the federal government to enforce or permit the enforcement of the 1866 Civil Rights Act is one example. but the explicit policies of the New Deal, where it entered the housing market for the first time, but always on a segregated basis, is perhaps the most powerful factor in creating the segregation that we know today.
I think it's important for us to understand the history, but I think moving forward, looking at solutions, I think that definitely the government should play a role in the solution since they created it. But what are some of the most promising things that you have seen in reference to, some things the government has done, or even other entities, I suppose, to help build generational wealth for African Americans that they've lost over many, many years?
Well, I don't think we've done much actually. And I don't think it's because of a lack of policy ideas. We know what we need to do. We know how to redress segregation. As you just said, the government did it, the government can uncreate it. In fact, it's quite a hopeful thing that we understand this history, because as long as we think it happened by accident, it's easy to delude ourselves that it can only unhappen by accident. Once we realize that it was created by government, it's logically follows that government can uncreate it if it's willing to do it. And at this point, there's not the political support to do it. What we need more than policy ideas, we've got lots of policy ideas. I could spend an hour talking to you about, well, maybe 10 hours, talking to you about policy ideas to redress segregation. What's missing is a civil rights movement that's going to be as aggressive in taking on residential segregation as it was in the 20th century to taking on the segregation of lunch counters and buses and swimming pools and water fountains and other institutions, public institutions. So we need a new civil rights movement. The policies are well known. I can give you a couple of quick examples, but I don't focus much on policy because that's not the problem. The problem is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it happen. So I mentioned Levittown, for example. I guess you brought it up, and I think that's a good example. We can use that here too. Those homes that the federal government created by subsidizing Levitt on a racially exclusive basis in the mid-20th century were inexpensive, and this was true of all the suburbs like that. They sold for, $8,000, $9,000 a piece in 1950. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Returning war veterans required no down payment. Black and white workers could easily have afforded those homes. They were inexpensive. Anybody with a job, and especially a veteran who required no down payment, can afford a mortgage on a $100,000 home. In fact, the white families who were subsidized into these homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of those homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of maybe temporary emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments on their own homes. African Americans have prohibited from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is that today, although African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. Well, that seems like an enormous problem. It's not easy to fix. The federal government, as an affirmative action program on housing narrowly targeted, should be buying up some homes in Levittown and reselling them for $100,000 to African Americans, to qualified African Americans. Buy them up at market rates, resell them to people whose families were excluded from living in that community when they were affordable. It's an easy thing to figure out. What's difficult is not the policy. What's difficult is the political mobilization that only a new civil rights movement can create. We have many, many other policies that, like I say, are well known. I just talked about a policy that would be available for African Americans who are working families who can afford a mortgage on a $100,000 home. You don't have to be rich to do that. But what about the very poor? Well, the federal government has a tax subsidy that it gives to developers to build housing for low-income families. It's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's distributed to developers to build housing. It's affordable. They're subsidized to rental housing for low-income families. The federal government, the Treasury Department's regulations place a priority on using these tax credits in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's crazy. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. It's not that we shouldn't be building housing in those neighborhoods. We should be building good housing everywhere. But we should certainly be placing a priority in creating units that are affordable to lower income, disproportionately Black and Hispanic families in higher opportunity neighborhoods where there is access to good jobs and transportation and supermarkets to sell fresh food. That's an easy policy to fix. So the policies are, and I mentioned earlier, by the way, I mentioned zoning laws. It doesn't cost anything to prohibit zoning laws that exclude all but the wealthy from a community. So the policies are well known. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain the segregated patterns that we have today.
Yeah, I think that what I saw, I think I seen something today in the news, it just came through my watch or my phone or whatever, that now more than ever is like a majority anti-racist society. So the will is probably the strongest now than it has ever been. So I guess we'll see what that actually materializes into though.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very hopeful. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race, the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever have had before in American history. So the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that took place after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, very encouraging. 25 million Americans took part in those demonstrations, mostly white. So we are having that conversation. We do have now the awareness that makes it possible to move forward. But you know, if I may be permitted to use a cliche, talk is cheap. What we need are new civil rights groups that are actually going to have the discipline, the program, the stick-with-itiveness to make, as John Lewis said, good trouble, to make it uncomfortable to maintain these patterns of segregation, which are unconstitutional and which underlie so much of the inequality in the society that we have today.
Thank you.
You make us uncomfortable, but you encourage us at the same time. The spirit of the book is amazing. And you indict everybody. You don't just speak to the government. I'm looking at the epilogue, which I loved your epilogue. You indict federal, state, local governments, the courts, the universities, real estate commissions, highway planners, the police, churches, and so forth. Everyone gets it, which I found personally very challenging. My question would be, when you look at, as a minister, and a lot of the speaking I'm doing is faith related, do you think that churches and synagogues these days, maybe say in the last decade or so, are less a part of the problem than they obviously were in the past, going back a few decades? What's your honest take on that, Richard? Well,
you know, there's a cliche that the most segregated hour of the week is Sunday morning. So, you know, the first step in creating a new civil rights movement that's going to take action to redress segregation has to be the creation of biracial, multi-ethnic committees. Churches and synagogues have to reach out to other race churches and synagogues and establish the kinds of social relationships out of which a multiracial, biracial, and multi-ethnic community can form. I'm writing a new book now about how to create a new civil rights movement and what we could do about it. And I'm describing right now something that happened in Winston-Salem almost 30 years ago. You may be familiar with it. As you know, better than I do, it's not just that there are some churches like the AME churches that are all Black and mainline Protestant churches that are all white. In the mainline Protestant denominations, there are separate Black and separate white churches. So in Winston-Salem, almost 30 years ago, there were 6 Presbyterian churches, 3 white, 3 black. The ministers, the pastors, and the congregations knew very little about each other. They had no contact. Eventually, one of the pastors, his name was Reverend Steve McCutcheon, called another one of the pastors who was black. The McCutcheon was white. He wrote a book about what happened later. After that, he called his book Let's Have Lunch. They met together, and out of that came something called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue in Winston-Salem. And that kind of, and that led to action. They helped to create a civilian review board in the Winston-Salem Police Department. They reformed the curriculum. That kind of thing has to be duplicated all over to create the basis of a civil rights movement.
The family of churches that Otoma and I are part of, I think has been highly integrated since the beginning. It would be very unusual to walk into, like here, I'm part of a church that's maybe 1,200 members. It's probably 40% black, maybe 40% white and everything else. So it's not that integrated, that segregated hour on Sunday, but I'm still not sure we're getting it. We talk to each other, we marry each other. I'm not sure even many of the minority members are aware, except from the unfair treatment they've received. They're not aware of the role of government leading up to now. So do you have any advice for us? Because we want to go beyond just integration. Integration is not the same thing as unity. We want to do what's right.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. The African Americans don't know this history any better than whites do. It's not taught in our schools. And as you know from reading the book, one of the things I do is I survey all the textbooks that are commonly used in American schools today. They lie about this history. Well, if I can give you one bit of advice for your churches, and it's presumptuous of me to give advice, but less talk, more action. The understanding will evolve from action, from joining together to make change. One of the easy things to do, first thing to do, is every one of these churches is in a community where the schools lie about this history. Well, let's challenge the curriculum as a first step, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than ours has, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So that would be an easy first step, that some of these, they read my book or other books like it. I'm not trying to promote my book. They read my
we'll
book,
do that for you.
Excuse me?
We'll do that for you. We'll promote
All right, yeah. But they read this book, they learn the history, and then they wonder, why aren't the schools teaching this? Why are the schools lying about it? And take action to end that. I've actually worked with a group of teachers to create a curriculum unit around this history. I can share it with you. There's also a 17-minute animated film for high school students that we've created around this history. There are lots of teachers who are voluntarily using these kinds of materials. It should be required. It should be part of the standard curriculum so that young people understand this history.
I guess we're not the only country that has this kind of slanted approach to textbooks. So many, I think of Israel, the way Palestinians are portrayed in Israeli textbooks. I think of the people who deny, not just obvious things like the Holocaust, but things that most people aren't aware of, the treatment of the Chinese by the Japanese or the Koreans. And it just, because I travel over the world, I see this pattern everywhere. I know it's not just an American thing.
Well, I used to be the education columnist at the New York Times. And I wrote a long column about these examples from different parts of the world,
right,
where textbooks lie about the history of their own countries and on this particular kind of issue.
So I'm sure you've probably received some pushback from your book, although probably not the facts, I would think. I think some of the interviews I've seen, no one is disputing the facts, but have you received pushback from any particular party? I'm thinking I could probably guess, but what have been your experience between like Democrats, Republicans, and if so, what has been some of the?
No, the pushback I've received, and I wouldn't even call it pushback, the denial that I've received does not, as you said, it doesn't, nobody disputes the facts I've recounted. In fact, the book has been out for 3.5 years now. Not a single fact in this book has been challenged. So by a professional historian, it's well established. The pushback is that people who want to dream that it can take care of it by itself. That's the argument that's used. If we just ask African Americans to work harder, to be more disciplined, this will go away. And that's absurd. The enormous wealth gap that I described, that is the consequence of this, is not going to be eliminated by hard work. It's an intergenerational wealth gap. One of the biggest sources of wealth that Americans have today is they inherit wealth from their parents. But African Americans don't, because they were prohibited by federal policy from accumulating that wealth in the first place. And no matter how hard you work, you're not going to narrow that wealth gap. So that's the only pushback I've gotten. People will say, well, the government did create this. We understand that. But the government shouldn't try to fix it because that will have unintended consequences. Well, everything has unintended consequences, and you have to be careful not to try to avoid them to the extent that you can, to be deliberate and careful about the policies that you implement. But that's no excuse for not fixing something that's broken. We don't use that anywhere else, and we can't use it with respect to government policy, because there's no other way of doing it. There's no way to take this one example that we've been talking about, and if we had hours, I can give you many other examples, but there's no way that wealth gap can disappear by itself, simply by telling people to work harder.
So I think that, from what you've shared, it seems like the biggest thing right now is getting a movement going and the political will that comes from that. So I know you're working on a book right now, but I think that's definitely something we'll be looking for. I know obviously with different movements going on right now, that's what, everyone is going after, but I agree. Talk is cheap. Policies there's hundreds of them, but we need to have that action going. So thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciated that you addressed other minorities. I mean, I think even until a week ago, I was thinking certainly Blacks have been mistreated the most, but every minority gets mistreated and can probably do better if they work harder. And I'm ashamed that I would even feel that way. Could you speak to that for just a moment? Because you talk about the way immigrants integrate, and particularly how after in that third generation, there's a change where they become more thoroughly American and they're able to take part in what Blacks have been excluded from. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, yes. If you think about it, it's obvious. The legacies of slavery are unique in this country. It is, slavery is not comparable to immigration. Descendants of American enslaved people have obstacles that others do not have. For one thing, we have developed stereotypes of African-American behavior based on the fact that they were enslaved. And Americans, white Americans, expect African-Americans to behave in servile ways because for hundreds of years, they were forced to behave in servile ways. And people observe behavior of others and draw conclusions about their innate characteristics without understanding the external forces that created that behavior. That's not true of any other immigrant group. So you're absolutely right. We have lots of low-income immigrants. Some of them were subject to some state-sponsored discrimination, unconstitutional discrimination. Certainly Mexican immigrants in California and Texas and Colorado were the subject of many forms of state-sponsored discrimination, nothing compared to slavery. Native Americans, certainly, and maybe that is comparable to slavery in some respects, but Native Americans are not dispersed as a group throughout the country the way other immigrants are. So the situation of African Americans is unique. If we fixed it, certainly other groups would benefit from the policies as well. For example, to take the example I gave before, if the low-income housing tax credit developments were placed in higher opportunity neighborhoods to a greater extent than they are now, certainly many low-income Hispanics would benefit from that policy. So it's not that there's not overlap, but the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow are unique to African Americans. When the policies that I was describing earlier were imposed by the New Deal and subsequently in the mid-20th century, they were directed at African Americans, not at other immigrant groups. There were no, we built public housing projects and segregated them as I described, one for blacks, one for whites. We didn't build a separate project for Italians or a separate project for Jews or a separate project for other immigrant groups. So to talk about the term minorities in this general way without understanding that the legacies of slavery in this country are a unique stain on the American character that we've never dealt with is a way of avoiding reality.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Mr. Jacoby?
Oh, to add, I mean, Richard he's made it so clear. I mean, it's a solid case. Again, I feel, you know, people ask me, am I racist? And I've taken these online tests where I'm thinking I must have scored fairly high, and it turns out, you know, no, I'm near the bottom. Whether I'm racist or not, it's indisputable that I've benefited as a white man from racist structures. There's no question of that. I benefit from that. I'm part of that. The case in The Color of Law is solid. It's I'm stunned that no one has even challenged the facts in there. It's not because it's an unread book. This is a very public kind of document, and it's been out for years. I hope that everyone will read this book. I speak to my fellow believers. Often I find that Christians have very strong opinions. It could be about history, about science, it could be about race, but it's not based on actual study they've done. I say, so what books have you read on each side of the issue? And for those who claim to represent truth, to speak for God, which is a very daring thing to do, there's no excuse, zero excuse for not being informed, especially now that the information has been made so accessible. So for my part, I will continue to promote the book, and I'm very humbled by it and very appreciative to be part of this interview. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me say one thing in conclusion, if I may. In addition to writing a new book about what we can do about it and how we can create that kind of civil rights movement, I'm also working with a group of national civil rights leaders, fair housing advocates, to create something we call a new national committee to redress segregation in housing. We're about to launch it before the pandemic shut everything down, because the goal of this national committee is to send organizers into different communities to help people translate their awareness into action, to create new civil rights groups. But I don't know how your network of churches works, but if anybody in your network wants to be informed when we announce the launch of this committee, well, just send me a list of names and email addresses, and particularly the communities where they live, because we will put them in touch with other people in their community who want to form these civil rights groups. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and good luck to both of you.
Well, thanks again so much for writing this book. I think it's just an amazing book. I think if I were to explain it to someone, they might think it's a dry book, but the way that it's written and the examples, and I think you had just the way everything weaves together is just really well done. And it's, as we've noticed, indisputable. So again, thanks so much for this. When is your next book tentatively coming out? I know this one was, I think, 10 years in the making. So
yeah, as you can see, I'm an old man. I don't have to be accountable to anybody. So when it's done, it'll be done.
Got it. Well, I'm glad that you still will be assisting with the movement, and we'll definitely get you some email addresses. I'm actually part of a group now. I think it's called Abolitioning Disciples to Abolish the New Jim Crow. And we're kind of in the initial phases right now, but the whole point is to start a movement that can come up with some practical ways that we can start to address some of the issues that we see in society. So,
well, I will today or tomorrow send you a note describing how you can get this list onto the launch announcement.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
For those that definitely watched this episode and enjoyed it, please click like and don't forget to subscribe for more great episodes. Thank you.
Thank you.